Hi, Laurens.
Hi.
We're going to talk about NHR 2.0.
Yeah, correct.
So, what do we have to know about NHR 2.0?
Right, so NHR 2.0 is the successor of NHR 1.0, or just NHR, which was the Non-Habitual Resident program, an expat regime by Portugal, designed to attract foreign talent, skilled workers from abroad to Portugal in 2009 after the financial crisis.
And non-habitual resident means newcomer, so somebody who was not, who did not live in Portugal before and decided to move to Portugal to attract those people, especially skilled people from abroad to Portugal in 2009. This regime was created and it was hugely popular.
Exactly, so it was for people who hadn't lived in Portugal in the previous 5 tax years. And it was very popular indeed because there was a list of high value adding professions. So let's say architects, software engineers, and that list has been revised over the last couple of years. And those people enjoyed a 20% flat tax on employment and self-employment income. And most foreign sourced income was exempt if it was taxable abroad. Let's say. So that also meant that it was basically a victim of its own success. Because I mean, lots of foreigners didn't contribute that much in tax revenue in Portugal.
And had a lot of financial firepower because they were hardly taxed, or at least in Portugal they were hardly taxed, maybe in the country where they had income, but
of course. But in Portugal they were not. I mean, it depends on the situation, of course, but not that heavily taxed. And because of that financial firepower, they had I mean, you have the means to rent at a higher price, for example. So that drove up the rental prices.
Because we're based in Lisbon, and we saw it with our own eyes, how quickly housing prices shot up here in the city. And I think throughout Portugal. So I think maybe that could have been the spark. Why?
Exactly. That was the spark, and also because Portuguese taxes for Portuguese people are quite high in general. So it does make sense that if you see there's a benefit that's given to non-Portuguese people, let's say, that feels a bit unfair, and that's also why the government called it a fiscal injustice that they needed to repair. And NHR 2.0 is, a bit more specific, a bit more selective. So it's really targeting niche sectors.
So the bad news for people who want to move to Portugal and who want to make use of this regime. So the bad news is that it has been abolished. It doesn't exist anymore. And the good news, perhaps, is that for some people there is a successor. NHR 2.0 we call it here, but that's for a very specific subset, a very specific group of
so
people.
It's for tech, R&D, scientific research. Those are sectors you can think about, but let's say for 95% of people it's no longer accessible. And also previously under NHR 1, let's say, you also saw that a lot of people that maybe shouldn't even have qualified, they didn't even qualify for NHR, that they also got NHR.
It was extremely
let's
easy
say managers,
to...
and it was quite easy in practice to get NHR. So it was not that, focused, not that selective.
And looking at NHR, so the NHR 2.0, the benefits that existed under the previous NHR regime, are they still available to the people under the new NHR regime?
Exactly. So, the 20% flat tax for employment, self-employment, it's still there. But now the list of high value adding professions has been narrowed down significantly. So it's tech, R&D, scientific research. And then the foreign source income, that is exempt if it's taxable in a country with which Portugal has a double taxation.
And exempt means that Portugal won't touch it, Portugal won't do anything with it as long as it's taxable, or that it could be taxed in the country where it comes from.
Exactly, so if the taxation treaty allocates the right of taxation to that other country, then Portugal would exempt it. It still needs to be reported in Portugal. So your NHR tax return is therefore always more complex, because all the worldwide income still needs to be reported, but indeed it might be exempted. Under NHR 1, there was also a flat tax of 10% on pensions, and with NHR 2, pensions are no longer part of that foreign income scope. So pensions would just be subject to Portuguese taxes.
Yeah, which is, let's say, quite brutal if you go all the way up to the highest bracket. That's almost 50%. So, yeah.
And that means that capital gains are now part of the package, let's say, foreign income that can be exempted if those capital gains are foreign sourced capital gains.
Yeah. Okay. So most important takeaway probably is that the number of people or the group of people that qualify for NHR is much smaller, but that, let's say, the basics of NHR still exist for those people.
Exactly,
yeah. Okay. Looking at some other details that might be of interest for people watching or listening. So how long does it last, this whole thing, the NHR regime?
That's still 10 years, so nothing changed there. But it's important to mention that you cannot have had NHR or some other expat regime previously.
Yeah.
So you need to be a newcomer as an expat as well.
Yeah. And still that you have to be, let's say, a foreigner or a newcomer is still considered as 5 years abroad. So
yes, exactly. It's still those 5 years. So it can also apply to Portuguese people that have been abroad for 8 years, let's say, and they come back to Portugal. And if they work in R&D, tech, or scientific research, academia, etc., they might they might apply for NHR 2.
Yeah, yeah. So I see. And so if you were a tax resident in Portugal, let's say 4 years ago, then you cannot apply, or you should wait for another year probably before.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Before
moving there.
Yeah. Okay. Other things that we would like to share. So what are some examples of? Because we talked about those groups that now qualify.
Yes.
But could you perhaps give
an example could be a researcher holding a PhD, certain R&D projects within Portugal. There are lists for that, let's say. So those are two practical examples indeed.
Yeah.
Also some organizations that are focused on knowledge creation. Sounds a bit vague, but there are some guidelines what qualifies and what not. Yeah. There's also something in the Portuguese startup sphere. Yeah. So some people might still apply, might still be eligible, but as mentioned, the list is way smaller than it used to be.
Yeah, okay. And if you want to apply, how do you do that? So what's the first step?
Yeah, I mean the first step is become a resident of Portugal, so you apply for residency. So if you're European, you just go to Portugal and you register. Yeah. Outside of the EU, you probably need a visa process. Then in Portugal you get your NIF. A NIF is a fiscal number, fiscal identification number. It's quite hard to...
Número de identificação fiscal.
Exactly, yeah. So it's quite hard to obtain, as in it's not hard, it's just a process that you will probably not like that much. Yeah. So for people that are already in Portugal, mostly they queue up at a Loja de Cidadão. Yeah. And people who are not yet in Portugal typically approach a legal representative to apply for the NIF on their behalf. Otherwise, it can also take a lot of time before you get your NIF. It can be up to 3 weeks before it's sent by post.
I have some first-hand experience with, let's say, the rough way to get your NIF.
And the rough way is then if you queue up? Or?
Yeah, that's queuing up at the Finanças Loja de Cidadão, which takes hours. It's a real Portuguese experience. Yeah. To be honest, I cannot recommend it, but it's an option. But we can help you with a NIF without queuing up and being in line for hours. Exactly. Yeah. So
But so then when you are a tax resident, because when you have a NIF and the NIF is connected to a Portuguese address, then you're considered a tax resident by Portugal, practically speaking. Yeah. And if you still have your NIF on a foreign address, then Portugal will not yet, practically speaking, consider you as a tax resident.
Yeah, strictly speaking, it's not really, let's say, related to NHR 2.0, the subject that we're talking about, but still it is interesting to stress it, or helpful, I think, for many people to stress that. When you have a NIF, you can either link that to a foreign address or a Portuguese address. Yes. And when you link it to a if you link it to a Portuguese address, then you're considered a tax resident. So
Exactly,
it's
yeah.
quite a decision. Even people often don't know that they do that, or that's
Exactly, people are unaware of it.
Yeah.
And it can also lead to some problems. Let's say if you move to Portugal in December, and your NIF is already on your Portuguese address, and you miss the deadline later on for NHR, that could mean that when you're applying for NHR the year after, that Portugal says you've already been a tax resident in one of the preceding 5 years.
Yeah.
So you can have practical problems.
Yeah.
And just in general, when are you expected to do a tax return in
Yeah.
Portugal? That's just from the moment onwards that you link your NIF to a Portuguese address. And by the way, that doesn't mean that if you live in Portugal for 10 years and you've just never linked it to your Portuguese address, that you're not a Portuguese tax resident.
No.
It's just, the point.
It's the other way around, that if you do so, then that will be seen as proof or a strong indication that you became a tax resident. And of course it makes sense, because if you say that your address is in Portugal, then apparently you moved your life to Portugal, and moving your life to a certain country implies that you become a tax resident there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So okay, so you have to become a tax resident, and then when you're a tax resident,
then you online you can apply for NHR, and then you need to get a few documents ready. So proof of non-residency of those last 5 years.
Yeah.
So you can be asked to prove that you did not live in Portugal. Yeah. For example, by tax returns or other means. And also proof of your qualifications, of your skills. It can be a master's degree, bachelor's degree, 5 years of work experience. There's a list for that as well, to show that you're actually on that list of high value adding professions, and that you're not just claiming to be.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. So there's also a deadline for that.
Yeah, that's March 31st, and then again
following the tax year.
Following that tax year.
Yeah.
So even if you moved in December, then the deadline is also March 31st.
Yeah.
If you moved in January of that previous tax year, it's also March 31st of the next year. So that's what people should take into account.
Yeah. And last question, perhaps most important one, how can we help? How can Tytle
we can help by evaluating whether you can still get NHR 2.0. Yeah. With that whole application, we can do it practically. Any tax advice in Portugal or back home, let's say if you're coming from the US, we can also help with your tax return or any advice in the US, in Portugal as well. And it's very easy because when you log into Tytle, you will get into a dashboard, and in any country where you need advice or findings or whatever, we have it in one place, and our advisors also talk with each other. For example, if the US advisor needs something from Portugal, from the Portuguese advisor, if it's necessary for the tax return or for something else, then all of that is streamlined and in one place. So it's basically advice, filings, bookkeeping, NHR applications. It's all centered in your dashboard.
And if you haven't been abroad or moved abroad yet, then probably you don't know yet how extremely helpful it can be to have everything under one roof. But you will soon find out if you become an expat that it can be extremely helpful to have, let's say, those experts speaking with each other and have it all, let's say, have a one-stop shop, so to speak, for your tax matters. Okay, that was it. Thanks a lot. Thanks for listening and watching, and hope to see you back in the new show. Bye-bye.